A formation of Imperial Japanese Navy carriers plows through calm waters, bristling with aircraft poised for battle. Aboard Shōkaku, flight deck crews scramble to refuel and rearm returning planes, unaware of the danger lurking below. Suddenly, the hull shudders. 3 torpedo impacts rip open Shōkaku's bow. Within moments, thick black smoke billows from the carrier's hangar deck as aviation fuel ignites into a raging inferno. Alarms echo through the ship, and sailors fight to contain the flames, but Shōkaku is mortally wounded. With one last thunderous roar from exploding fuel vapors, Shōkaku slips beneath the surface, taking over 1,200 of her crew with her. This is the story of Shōkaku, a vessel that embodied the peak of Japanese carrier design, from her triumphs at Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea to her final destruction in the Philippine Sea. Commissioned in August 1941, IJN Shokaku represented a new generation of Japanese aircraft carriers built on the eve of World War II. Freed from earlier naval treaty limits, Japan had poured its latest technology and experience into Shokaku's design. At about 844 feet long and displacing over 32,000 tons at full load, she was significantly larger and more robust than pre-war carriers. Shokaku's power came from 4 steam turbine engines producing 160,000 shaft horsepower, driving her to a swift 34-knot top speed, an impressive pace that allowed her to keep up with the fastest fleet units. With a range of 9,700 nautical miles at cruising speed, she could roam the vast Pacific and project air power far from home ports. Shokaku's design balanced speed, range, and protection. Her builders incorporated unusually heavy armor for an aircraft carrier, reflecting lessons from earlier carrier battles. Vital areas, machinery spaces, aviation fuel tanks, and magazines were shielded by armor up to 8.5 inches thick in places. A strengthened armored deck and belt gave Shōkaku a fighting chance to survive bomb hits that might devastate a lesser ship. This protection would prove crucial in keeping her afloat during several ferocious battles to come. Above the armored hull stretched a full-length flight deck, nearly 795 feet long, serviced by 3 deck elevators linking 2 hangar levels below. This efficient layout allowed Shōkaku to operate a large air group, about 72 operational aircraft plus spares, one of the highest carrier complements of the time. On the eve of war in 1941, her typical air wing included a potent mix of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. For example, 18 Zero fighters, 27 Val dive bombers, and 27 Kate torpedo bombers were embarked for the Pearl Harbor operation. This balance of aircraft types gave Shōkaku both a formidable offensive punch and a defensive fighter screen. To defend herself, Shōkaku was armed with an array of anti-aircraft guns. Along her flanks were 8 twin-mounted 5-inch dual-purpose guns, capable of firing high-explosive shells at attacking aircraft or engaging enemy ships. For close-range defense, she carried at least 12 triple mounts of 25mm anti-air guns, 36 barrels initially, with more added later in the war. These light guns could put up a dense flak screen, though they suffered from problems like slow training and frequent reloading. By 1944, Shōkaku's anti-aircraft suite had been augmented considerably, reflecting the increasingly dire air threat. She was also among the first Japanese carriers fitted with air search radar, a Type 21 set, by late 1942, a noteworthy technological improvement that would later help alert her crew to incoming air attacks. However, one design issue lurked unseen. Like all pre-war Japanese carriers, Shōkaku's aviation gasoline tanks were built into the hull structure without the protective enclosures used in some Allied designs. This meant that shock from bombs and torpedoes could crack fuel tanks and spread flammable vapors inside the ship. After the carrier disasters at Midway, the Japanese tried to mitigate this by pumping inert gas or even pouring concrete around empty fuel spaces. But, as Shōkaku's final moments would demonstrate, these measures were not enough to prevent fuel vapor explosions once damage occurred. In all, Shōkaku was a formidable fleet carrier, fast, well-armed, with a large air group and unusually strong construction. she would soon put all of these qualities to the test. Shokaku entered service in mid-1941 as the lead ship of Japan's 5th Carrier Division, alongside her sister Zuikaku. She immediately joined Vice Admiral Nagumo's Kido Butai, participating in the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Her air group struck US warships and facilities in the second wave, returning home unscathed and heralded as part of Japan's new striking arm. In early 1942, Shokaku's aircraft supported operations across the Pacific, from Rabaul to the Indian Ocean raid, where her squadrons helped sink the British cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire and the carrier Hermes. By May, she was part of Operation MO, Japan's push toward Port Moresby, leading to the Battle of the Coral Sea, the world's first carrier-versus-carrier engagement. Shokaku's aircrews helped cripple USS Lexington, but in return, US Dauntless dive bombers from Yorktown hit Shokaku with 3 1,000-pound bombs, tearing open her flight deck and killing over 100 crewmen. She barely survived the storm-tossed voyage back to Japan for repairs. The damage kept her out of the Battle of Midway, sparing her from the disaster that destroyed 4 other Japanese carriers. Once repaired, Shokaku returned to action at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, where her planes damaged Enterprise, but the battle ended indecisively. 2 months later, at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, her air group helped sink Hornet, though Shokaku herself was hit by several bombs. Thanks to improved radar and new safety measures that drained aviation fuel lines before battle, her crew prevented the fires from reaching her magazines, a feat of damage control that saved the ship. After extensive repairs at Kure, Shokaku operated from Truk Lagoon through 1943, one of the few veteran carriers still afloat, and saw limited action as Japan's carrier strength dwindled. By early 1944, Shokaku and Zuikaku were among the last first-line carriers available, veterans of nearly every major engagement from Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal, and the core of what remained of the Imperial Navy's carrier force. In early 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy consolidated its remaining carrier strength for a decisive defense of the homeland's inner perimeter. Shokaku and her sister, Zuikaku, were sent to the Linga Islands, south of Singapore, in the spring of 1944 to train and await action. This forward location also put them closer to sources of fuel oil, which were growing scarce in Japan. By June, US forces began their assault on the Mariana Islands, the invasion of Saipan on June 15, 1944, threatening Japan's inner defense line. The Japanese High Command activated Operation Eigo, a plan to mass the mobile fleet and counterattack the US Navy in a decisive battle. Shokaku departed Linga with Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's first mobile fleet on June 15, 1944, joining a formidable armada of 9 carriers, including the brand new carrier Taiho as flagship, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Steaming through the Philippines, the fleet refueled and then headed northeast toward the Mariana Islands, determined to engage the US carrier task forces in what would become the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Ozawa's battle plan was ambitious: launch massive waves of carrier aircraft at the US fleet from long range, while also coordinating strikes from land-based air units in the Marianas. The goal was to overwhelm the Americans, sink their carriers, and halt the US advance. By June 18, 1944, Shokaku and the mobile fleet were in position west of the Marianas. Early on June 19th, Japanese reconnaissance located the US Fifth Fleet, and Ozawa ordered his carriers to launch their first attacks. Shokaku's decks roared to life that morning as she launched multiple squadrons of Judy dive bombers, Jill torpedo bombers, and Zero fighters, part of a series of complex strike waves hurled toward the enemy fleet. The departing aircraft left Shokaku with a relatively small reserve aboard, as most of her air group was in the air or had been dispatched. The ensuing aerial battles on June 19th would earn the day the nickname Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. US Navy fighters and anti-aircraft guns slaughtered the incoming Japanese planes with minimal losses. Shokaku's air groups suffered terribly. Still, some of her aviators distinguished themselves. A group of Shokaku's veteran dive bomber pilots, many of whom had fought at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, managed to break through the American defenses. In a rare success that day, one of Shokaku's D-4 Waisuisei dive bombers scored a bomb hit on the battleship USS South Dakota, causing damage and casualties to the American crew. It was a small revenge for the ship that had been repeatedly battered by US Dauntlesses in earlier battles. But such victories were few. By noon, the Japanese carrier air groups had been decimated, with hundreds of planes shot down across the fleet. As Shokaku recovered the surviving aircraft from the morning strikes, the ship's crew also faced another invisible threat. American submarines, deployed in a scouting line, had been tracking the Japanese fleet's approach. Earlier that same morning, the brand new carrier, Taiho, sailing not far from Shokaku, was struck by a torpedo from the USS Albacore. The damage to Taiho initially seemed contained, but gasoline vapors gathered and later ignited in a catastrophic explosion, sinking Japan's flagship around midday. Unaware of Taiho's impending doom, Shokaku's crew remained focused on their own operations. By late morning, Shokaku was slightly isolated at the rear of Ozawa's formation, intent on recovering aircraft and readying a possible second wave. At 11:20 on June 19, 1944, the US submarine USS Cavalla, commanded by Commander Herman J. Kostler, penetrated the screen of Shokaku's task group. Cavalla had been vectored into the area just hours before, and now the submarine's periscope tracked Shokaku's enormous grey hull cutting through the sea. Kostler maneuvered into an attack position undetected. At 11:22, Cavalla fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the carrier. Shokaku's lookouts spotted telltale tracks frothing toward them too late. Within seconds, 3 or 4 torpedoes slammed into Shokaku's starboard side in rapid succession. One torpedo exploded forward on the starboard bow, near where ordnance was stored, and others struck along the hull amidships. The blows were devastating. A tremendous geyser of water and debris rose alongside Shokaku as the explosions tore open her compartments. Inside the carrier, the effect was immediate and calamitous. The forward hit caused heavy flooding in the bow, and Shokaku began to settle by the bow almost at once. Other torpedoes ripped into the hangar and machinery spaces, knocking out generators and starting fires in the hangar deck. Worse still, Shokaku was in the middle of refueling and rearming operations for her aircraft when the torpedoes struck. Fuel hoses had been rigged, and ammunition was exposed on the hangar deck as crews hurried to turn around the returning planes. The torpedo impacts ruptured fuel lines and hurled fuel carts into the air, spraying volatile aviation gasoline throughout the hangar. Within minutes, multiple fires raged out of control, fed by the leaking gas. Black smoke poured from the stricken carrier as firefighting crews fought in vain to contain the blaze. The ship rapidly developed a list as seawater flooded her starboard side. On the flight deck, sailors desperately pushed surviving aircraft overboard to eliminate fuel loads and tried to smother flames with foam, but the inferno spread with frightening speed. Amid the chaos, Shokaku's captain, Matsubara Hiroshi, realized the ship was in grave peril. By noon, Shokaku was low in the water forward. The order was given to abandon ship as explosions rattled the carrier's interior. At around 12:10 p.m., a colossal blast blew Shokaku apart from within. One of the fires had detonated either a stockpile of bombs in the hangar or the forward magazine, and the resulting explosion ignited accumulated gasoline vapors, creating a devastating chain reaction. Witnesses on other ships saw a fireball and pieces of flight deck hurled high above the carrier. Within minutes, the soaring crane was done for. Shokaku rapidly sank bow first, her ensign still flying, and slipped under the waves of the Philippine Sea. The sinking was swift, giving crew members topside little time to get clear. Hundreds of men were trapped below as the carrier went down. Shokaku's demise was catastrophic in human terms. Of a complement of around 1,660 plus air group personnel and officers, an estimated 1,272 men went down with the ship. This toll included hundreds of skilled aviators and deck crew, as well as 8 civilians, technicians, and journalists attached to the fleet. Captain Matsubara was among those who managed to abandon ship at the last moments. He, along with 570 survivors, were plucked from the oil-stained water by the nearby cruiser Yahagi and destroyers Urakazi, Wakatsuki, and Hatsuzuki. These rescue ships managed to save less than 1/4 of Shokaku's crew. The rest, nearly 3/4 of her company, perished inside the carrier or in the sea. Meanwhile, USS Cavalla, having scored a fatal blow on its first war patrol, endured a vicious depth charging from escorting destroyers. Though shaken and damaged, the submarine slipped away, later surfacing to confirm by radio the sinking of a large Japanese carrier. For this action, Cavalla's crew earned a Presidential Unit Citation, while the Imperial Japanese Navy mourned the loss of one of its finest flat tops. With Shokaku and Taiho both sunk on June 19th, Vice Admiral Ozawa's mobile fleet was left with only a handful of operational carriers, Zuikaku and a few smaller carriers, for the second day of battle. The Battle of the Philippine Sea concluded on June 20th with a one-sided American victory. Not a single US carrier was lost, while Japan's naval air arm was effectively annihilated. Shokaku's sister ship Zuikaku survived that battle, recovering many of the few remaining aircraft, only to be sacrificed as a decoy force at Leyte Gulf later in October 1944. The loss of Shokaku marked the collapse of Japan's veteran carrier arm. From Pearl Harbor to the Solomons, she had served as one of the fleet's most capable and battle-hardened carriers. Her sinking in June 1944, alongside Taiho and Hyo, crippled Japan's ability to project naval air power, just as the US Navy reached its peak strength. The Battle of the Philippine Sea proved catastrophic. More than 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, while the Americans suffered almost no ship losses. For Japan, it was the end of the carrier war. Shokaku's destruction also revealed the fatal flaws of Japanese carrier design. Despite her armor and experienced crew, she succumbed to the same vulnerability that doomed Taiho: aviation fuel vapor and poor compartmentalization. Earlier reforms had improved safety, demonstrated at Santa Cruz, where quick action prevented secondary explosions. But no carrier could survive multiple torpedoes while refueling aircraft. Shokaku's death underscored how dangerous aviation fuel handling was in combat, prompting future navies to redesign fuel systems, reinforce damage control, and isolating hangars. Strategically, her loss stripped Japan of one of its last fully trained air groups and a symbol of its early war dominance. Even if Shokaku had survived, the Imperial Navy's shortage of trained pilots and aircraft meant she could no longer change the outcome. By the summer of 1944, Japan's carriers were powerful in name only, empty decks without the veteran aviators that once made them feared. Shokaku's service mirrors the rise and fall of Japan's naval empire. Bold in conception, brilliant in early execution, but ultimately overcome by superior resources and relentless attrition. From her triumph at Pearl Harbor to her fiery end in the Philippine Sea, Shokaku embodied both the power and fragility of Japan's carrier fleet, a ship whose fate mirrored the course of the empire she served.